Hi everyone, my name is Joseph and welcome to Digimon Seekers Part 7 of Chapter 3, Unit 11, Digimon Missing in Action. So it's looking like this might be the last chapter where we're not stuck in the past, but where we're still getting some background information. It's looking like the next part we're finally going to, we already are in the present timeline, but we're finally going to possibly maybe find out some more information about our current protagonist, or rather the story's protagonists, E.G. and Leon. Anywho, but let's start with the first quote. Yolene, Koski, and Saya fancy themselves astronauts orbiting the moon, but in practice they were more akin to deep sea explorers plumbing the depths in their submersible. The visibility certainly wasn't as good as it would be in space, for one thing, and the team had yet to figure out how to capture sufficiently crisp visual data. Not even the exceptionally strong mind link between Agumon and Saya could be captured adequately by the comparatively low fidelity technology of the day, limiting the amount of information the team stood to gain. They may as well have been trawling the seafloor. They may as well have been trawling the sea. This, sorry everyone, I don't know why I'm mispronouncing this first quote so much. Let me start that portion over. They may as well have been trawling the seafloor with little more than a small flashlight to guide them. The Digimon pressed on, following the route that was programmed for them through the vast sea of junk data and digital noise. So I'm not going to lie, I really like this quote just because personally for me, I'm a big fan of whenever the story or the narrative keeps making these comparisons to how the team is akin to exploring space. But I really like how there's a shift, a slight shift perspective here. That it's more akin to going into the sea now rather than going out into space, because the fact that their data doesn't allow them to really see much, right? Because if one is going to deep dive, one does need specialized equipment because it becomes much more difficult to see the further down one goes. And personally, I'm just a big fan of that, just because usually there's this idea that about how essentially how space exploration is very similar to deep sea exploration. You need a suit for both, right? With astronauts, their space suit. With deep diving, the diver's suit. You need specialized equipment, and they both are very working in similar conditions. I've read in accounts where individuals say that when they go into the depths, it's quite easy to lose oneself, and you forget where up and down is, and it's almost like you are floating in space because everything is just pitch black. So there's little quick shift in perspective of how they're much more akin to deep sea explorers rather than um, space explorers. I just like that because I just feel like it really emphasizes again the fact that this team, they're exploring, they're pioneers trying to get more information about this new world that they have discovered. And also what I like about this, the Digimon pressed on, following the route that was programmed for them through the vast sea of junk data and digital noise. This is probably just me with too much imagination, but I can't help but imagine Palmon, Tentomon, and Agumon just kind of in a horror-like setting. Oh, I'm sure they could see the digital world just fine. I forget about that, right? I'm forgetting that from the human's perspective, everything looks out of reach, everything looks fuzzy. But I'm sure for the Digimon themselves, they're fine. But still, I just can't help but feel like a little bit of a horror-like setting. It's very fun, in my opinion. So continuing forward, let me go up a little bit. Yoli and Koski still don't know exactly what went wrong on the Tartarus probe. Something happened, but they wouldn't make out what. The only one who had seen whatever happened to the blurry black and white mush of a video feed was Saya. She would have been a meaningful packet. She would have seen a meaningful packet or some sort of malicious code execution, or perhaps something that qualified as sentient, a Digimon, perhaps. Whatever it was hostile. Even now, Yolene doesn't have anything to add to the story, given that the limited data she had to work with. She was there when it happened, yes, but she didn't see or hear anything that would crack the mystery right open. If forced, she would say she had a bad feeling just before it happened, but feelings aren't quantifiable data. So what's really interesting about this is that we know that in present time, for once you go into DMIA, it's a matter of going over one's mind limit or the L limit, the L line and all that, right? But it's looking more like in this instance, Saya did not over exceed her time limit. Rather, it's because that she was attacked by this unknown factor that she is in DMIA now. And I just find that really interesting because this implies that essentially there's two ways to go into DMIA. The first one that we're all familiar with, and that's going beyond the time limit, and the second one would be essentially being taken out. I suppose. What does taken out mean? We don't essentially know in this instance. Maybe Saya was in her consciousness. So maybe Agumon was maybe whatever had caught Agumon obviously had an influence, an impact, an effect on Saya's consciousness. But in this instance, again, it wasn't because of the time limit. It's because that they were attacked. Agumon was attacked. I'm really looking forward to finding out more about this, and I'm sure that we will as we continue going forward. What I also like about this quote is how the mystery that's surrounding what occurred about this event, and how Yolene, despite being present, she has no idea what occurred to Saya. And again, I just really love how they explain that the only one who would know what happened would be Saya. But of course, she's not present. She's gone. I feel like that adds a little bit more to that horror-like setting that I mentioned with the first quote. And then lastly, how if Yolene was pressed to state a comment, she would just state that she felt like something had occurred. But I love how she says that feelings aren't quantifiable, even though I would argue that they're valid in this instance, because whatever had happened, that feeling is much more better than no idea, having no evidence, but you can't really explore that feeling, right? Yeah, so I enjoyed it. I think it added flavor to the story. She remembered it was at the turning point. She remembered it was at the turning point of the mission when they were plotting out their closest approach to the digital world. Some sort of malicious code or AI entity had attacked them, for a lack of a better term. It's possible Saya's Agumon had been the target all along, although suppose it had been an unfortunate accident, like a ship ramming into an iceberg or a large sea creature and sinking. There was nothing concrete to hang on to. All Yolene remembered was Koski's panic when confronted with the unforeseen circumstances. His fiance's signal was gone, swallowed by some unseen monster, to hear him tell it. The partner Digimon were only doing what they were programmed to do. Koski fought for Saya's inclusion as a one-woman survey team, but if he had been the survey team instead, or activated manual controls and pulled her closer, but Koski didn't have that power. Professor Ruzenji did. The Tartarus probe was heavily damaged and barely functional. Palmon and Tentamon were injured as well. Right or wrong, the professor prioritized Koski and Yolene's safe return, so they wouldn't be tempted to try and rescue Saya. He couldn't risk all three of them going DMIA on the very first mission. So this is a bit of a longer quote. There's two elements to this. The first part that I want to discuss is just the reaction that's coming from Kyosuke. I could totally see why he's on the current path that he is now. It's quite clear and evident, I would argue, that from the past parts, Kosuke had some deep attraction and feelings towards Saya, and I would hope that they did, right? That he did, since they got married. But to see one's loved one all of a sudden just being taken out the way that she was, it is a little bit, again, maybe scary is too much of a dramatic word to use, but again, it really adds to that horror element, that feeling of mystery about what's going on. And I'm really enjoying it because I do feel like it adds to the atmosphere. It makes things a bit more darker than it needs to be, but it's dark because someone's gone now, right? What I also like about this quote is the reinforcement that, again, Saya was taken out not because of the time limit, because of something that was proactively seeking them out. Maybe, right? Yolene also says maybe it was just an accident, but they don't really know. And again, I do like that because it's just adding so much credence to the fact that this team does not know much about the digital world, and they were doing their best to explore. But obviously, this is a huge hiccup. Obviously, a hiccup that didn't being a permanent obstacle towards the professor, because obviously, E.G., Leon, they're mind linking. Yolene is mind linking, and not only that, but we have individuals beyond the students who are mind linking too. E.G., Leon, obviously, but also not Hatsune, excuse me. I believe Hatsune, Yolene's deputy, the one who also works with her. Excuse me, I always confuse her name with the secretary's name. So pardon me about that. I think I'm doing that right now. But you guys know what I mean. This was not a permanent obstacle. So it's just really interesting. I'm really kind of curious as to what made the professor decide to continue with the project and discover the time limit. Maybe we'll get some more information about that. Let me see. Give me a second. Yeah, so that's the first part. I like what that passage set up. And the second part that I like about this passage is how it emphasizes that Essentially, Koski seems to have some guilt, survivor's guilt for sure, right? But also guilt because of the fact that he might be blaming himself. Uh, Koski fought for Saya's inclusion as a one-woman survey team. If she wasn't present, she might have been okay. Maybe Koski would have been the one who was attacked, but I'm sure from his perspective, he would have been fine with that. And if we were to have a encounter where it was Koski who got DMIA'd, but Saya was still outside, I would argue that she wouldn't feel as well. She might feel guilty because she might feel like I should have been there to assist, but it wouldn't be the same kind of guilt because again, it's looking like Koski's the one that possibly convinced the professor to allow Saya to go onto the survey team. Again, that line, Koski fought for Saya's inclusion. That's really interesting, a really good tidbit of information that really adds to the situation. And this is why, again, Koski is going to have not just survivor's guilt, but also just guilty feelings in general because he's going to feel like Saya was only out in this mission because of him. If it wasn't because of him, she would be A-okay. And I also like how the professor, despite that being his daughter, he still prioritized the whole team's safety. I think that says a lot about him as a person. We'll come back to this shortly because there's another quote that discusses his reaction to about this. And then lastly, before I forget, I also like how it's pointed out that Saya was possibly the target. Is it possible that whatever this obtrusion, this anomaly was, that it specifically go after Saya, or again was just an accident? Really setting up the level of the aurora of mystery. Several years separated her, Yolene, from the failure of the Tartarus program. Years full of nights spent turning over the events of that mission in her mind. She and Koski returned to the real world to find Saya's comatose body lying beneath a sheet. Analysis of the mission data showed that her consciousness remained in Agumon's Digicore, which itself disappeared from the site of the accident. The best guess was that the Digicore had been taken somewhere else within the digital world. Saya was officially DMIA, the first person on record to go missing in the digital world. So again, what's so interesting about this is the best guess was that the Digicore had been taken somewhere else within the digital world. They don't know what happened to Saya's consciousness. It's possible that her consciousness is someplace, but it's going to be in the digital world, separate from her human body. I guess I never really thought about. I guess from the first part with Leon and EG, when I thought about DMIA, I just thought of it as one's consciousness being trapped within the Digicore, but that's really it. And the Digimon will go into standby mode essentially. Something also happened to the Digimon, but I never thought or considered that the consciousness might still be aware and they're just trapped within the Digimon, and we don't know what happened to that Agumon, right? Again, is it possible that this event is what led to the Black Agumon? At the beginning of the story, they're searching for a Black Agumon, not a regular Agumon, and constantly the story keeps saying Agumon, Agumon, Agumon. Agumon was Saya's partner, not Black Agumon. So again, I am looking forward to discovering more about that. Let me make sure that's everything I want to discuss. Yeah, and then lastly, she and Koski return to the real world to find Saya's comatose body lying beneath the sheet. Just a small line, but again, it really adds a little bit to that horror-centric, that horror aspect. I feel like that feeling of uncertainty of what's going on. There was nothing Yolene and Koski could have done. They didn't see or hear anything out there in the vast sea that was the network. All they knew was that Saya was gone when they came to. They sent a person with a record of incomplete mind links out on a mission with the rookie Digimon, mere babies, learning to totter along on their own 2 feet when they weren't sitting in a stroller. They should have been more careful. They should have built more contingencies into the plan. They had no idea how intelligent these life forms would be. Yolene thought she had a grasp of how risky it all was. She understood they were essentially trying to contact aliens. So essentially, just in hindsight, of course, everyone feels like they should have done more. That's understandable. I would argue that everything that we've seen so far, there probably was an element of being a little bit too impatient. Everyone seemed very gung-ho about discovering, discoveries, information about the digital world and what they could do with it. So more than likely, they did approach it too quickly, right? And it's a little bit sad how after this incident happens, the team seems to have all these regrets and they seem to be self-depreciating themselves. But I would argue, I don't think it was their fault. I think as we continue with the story, we're going to find out that whatever that anomaly was that went after Saya, it was something that was beyond their control. But maybe I'm wrong about that. We'll $5 to continue with the story. And another thing I like about this quote is that last line. Yolene thought she had a grasp of how risky it all was. She understood they were essentially trying to contact aliens. Again, it's really emphasizing the otherworldly nature of the digital world, the network, and the inhabitants that roam the digital world. Even though this team has connections with their Palmon, Agumon, and Tentomon, they need to keep in mind that essentially they are interacting with aliens. These new beings that's not part of the real world, but part of a separate world. Professor Rugini did everything he could to keep Saya in stable condition and keep his students safe. He kept the Tartarus program and its mind leak experiments going in secret to shield Yolene and Koski from the inherent risks. He had to ensure his research had a future, and they were key to its survival. The lengths he went to ensure his students were safe despite the loss of his daughter earned the respect of the small handful of staffers he briefed on the situation. So this line is what I was referring to before. I think it really does a lot to emphasize the professor's characterization. He is an individual who does care about the people he works with. He lost his daughter, but he's not going to be selfish enough to only focus on his daughter. He needs to keep the whole team in mind. And I think that really shows how strong of an individual the professor is, because I can't imagine, because Koski lost his fiance, his wife, and that's horrible. But the professor lost his daughter, right? Someone that he grew up with and seen grow for at the very least at least 21. It seems like they're in grad school, so I'm going to say 21, around 21 years old. But despite that, the professor keeps in mind that the rest of the team, they're just as important and valued as his own daughter. And I also like how he kept the Tartarus program and his mind experiments going in secret to shield Yolene and Koski from the inherent risks. So for me, what that says is that he may not have wanted to continue with the projects because it may have given him sad feelings, obviously, right? A really good example about this would be The Amazing Spider-Man 2, when Peter Parker, after, so minor spoilers, but it's an older movie, but after Gwen Stacy passes away, Parker stops being Spider-Man for a couple months, and everything's been crumbling. Criminals are now not running about like in Gotham City, but they are doing more than they typically do. I'm sure the reason why Parker didn't want to be Spider-Man was because he was reminded he couldn't be that go-lucky self persona that Spider-Man was known for, right? I would argue that more than likely the professor probably felt the same way. He probably had to keep up a certain kind of demeanor or face when working with everyone, especially to not let it reveal that his daughter was in DMIA and that the project was a failure. I'm sure that took a lot of mental fortitude. And he didn't just do it for himself, or at least I'm hoping he just do it for himself. But the textual evidence really does seem to imply that he did it not just for his own research, but also for his students as well. Because if everything had just stopped, an investigation probably would have incurred, and then Koski and Siuli may have gotten into trouble, or some ethical issues may have gotten into play, and everyone would have gotten into trouble, because that was something that was brought up in the previous part. And then not just beyond that as well, it's looking like it wasn't just Yolene and Koski that he was protecting, but everyone involved in the project. The lengths he went to ensure his students were safe, despite the loss of his daughter, and the respect of the small handful of staffers he briefed on the situation. So again, I just really like this line because I think it adds, and this might be the most positive line in this part, because this part I would argue is quite sad, a little bit depressing, but this line is very hopeful, not hopeful, but just very illuminating because of the goodwill that's being at play. But continuing forward, Yolene couldn't remember the last time she saw Koski. Was it really when he went to visit Saya in the hospital right after the accident? But she often wondered what became of him. He stopped coming to school and work, which is perfectly understandable. Before long, he stopped picking up the phone, answering emails, or so much as acknowledging her existence. It had been some time since she had anything about him from Professor Bridgenji either. I just think this is really sad because Koski was obviously a bright individual. All three of these individuals, Saya, Yolene, and Koski, were bright students. But unfortunately, to see Koski, I'm going to sound like a little bit like a boomer, but for him to throw his life away so close to graduating. Oh, so I guess maybe they weren't in grad school. They were finishing up their undergrad. Anywho, but so close to graduating, and yet he ends up dropping out because of the disappearance of his fiance. And I can't really blame him because I'm sure from his perspective, he probably has hope that Saya is still alive. Who knows, right? I should rewatch that trailer and see what dialogue Koski says. Does it imply that he thinks Saya is gone, or imply that he believes Saya could still be rescued? But I just find this, after that last quote that we just read, I found very positive, very illuminating in a positive kind of way. And I just find this quote to be very downtrodden. I really feel for Koski, and I have a lot of sympathy for Tartarus, even though he's supposed to be the quote unquote villain. But I don't think he's going to be the main antagonist. But continuing forward, I know we won't. We're almost done. When you have one more quote after this, I know we won't be able to visit her, not as easily anyway. Perhaps that's for the best, though. They're talking about Saya is going to be moved to an American hospital. A student of your caliber shouldn't be brought to a standstill like this. You risk not graduating. What about Koski? I've spoken with him. He's decided to drop out. It was simply a matter of timing for him as well. I will support him however I can. Time stopped for her and Koski after the accident, as did, as far as they knew, the Toddlers program and research into the digital world. Both were frozen at Professor Rugenzi's directive. She, Koski, and the professor were now scattered to the wind, and they couldn't do much more than worry about one another. She wondered if it was healthy for the professor to have thrown himself so completely into his research. Saya was a part of the lab, a part of the company, a part of the team that was. Yolene couldn't bring herself to contact Koski after he closed himself off from her. She figured it would be too painful, and Professor Rugenzi became too commanding a presence. She felt she couldn't engage him in silly conversations anymore. So the first part is really interesting how, so it seems like the professor did stop researching into the digital world, but again, obviously, that's not going to be true, or it's not going to be permanent, because we see that he continues researching into the digital world. But the fact that he was able to put a standstill to it, again, I think shows a lot about his character, and the fact that he wasn't just thinking about his research first and foremost, but also about the individuals who were assisting him. I would also like about this quote as well is the last part. And Professor Richards became too commanding a presence. She felt she couldn't engage him in silly conversations anymore. I feel like maybe that's a bit of a cop-out. I don't want to say that the writing was weak right here. It might be that this is purposefully being done for characterization on Yolene's behalf. The fact that, I would argue if she wanted to speak to the professor about Saya, it would be a hard subject to broach, but if she had questions, I think would be willing to address them. And if she had questions about Koski himself as well and wanted to talk about him, I don't think the professor would be standoffish about that. Again, it might be awkward, but the professor would be willing to engage in that conversation, especially if he thought there might be any hope in remedying the situation. I think that last line, she couldn't engage him in silly conversations anymore. There might be more characterization from Yolene's perspective, and that she's kind of not washing her hands of the situation, but she's emotionally numb, and she just doesn't know what to do, how to move forward. Koski is gone, Saya is gone, and now the professor at this time and moment is not doing his research, and he's obviously going to become in charge of the department, as stated in the first chapter. So that's what referencing at the end, right? He became too much of a commanding presence. I just feel like that's not really the translation, but rather characterization for Yolene's behavior, that she's making the choice to not engage with this mystery. And I don't really blame her for that, because it seems like this really impacted everyone at an emotional level. Hopefully that makes sense. I know I was a little bit stumbling over my words right there. This was actually the last quote, excuse me. But yeah, so I really am enjoying the part so far. I still am standing by what I said last time. I'm looking forward to going back to the present timeline. At the start of this video, I did say that we are back at the present timeline, but after rereading the quotes, I realized that it's not entirely true. We're slowly catching up. We're still at the part where we're getting to what we're familiar with. So with Yolene being the chief of the Digipolice, and working with other individuals, but we're not quite at the present timeline. But it wouldn't surprise me if the next part we were finally switching back gears over to EG, and I am quite looking forward to that. Thank you so much for listening. I do appreciate it. My question for everyone is, how did you feel about Saya's DMIA? Do you think it was emotionally impactful? Do you feel like, it was just kind of neutral? For me, I think it was emotionally impactful just because of the impact that she ended up having, or the DMIA ended up having on everyone. I think it really shows, the things that they lost after that Tartarus failure, the Tartarus project failure. But yeah, but that's my opinion. Thank you so much for listening. I do appreciate it. I hope everyone has a prodigious day, and you take care out there. Bye, everyone.